The humans left in silence, and the Galactic Council faced the disaster alone. Part 1. The hall was large and cold in the way that important places always are. The ceiling stretched high above rows of curved seats, and the light that came through the panels in the walls was pale and blue. At the front of the hall, behind a long table made of dark stone, sat Velith. He was old in the way that the Farron measured age, not by wrinkles but by the slowness of his secondary hands, which only moved when he was deep in thought or deep in boredom. Right now they were still. The session had been going for 2 hours. There had been reports from the Karate trade delegation, a long update from the Vorkai Boundary Patrol, and a short argument about water rights on a moon that no one in the room had ever visited. The usual business of the Galactic Council grinding forward like a stone wheel on flat ground. The senior archivist, a thin Farron named Sova, cleared her throat and looked down at her notes. She spoke without much expression. She said that humanity's 3 council seats were empty again. That made it 5 sessions in a row. She asked in the standard formal way whether the council wished to note the absence for the record. Velith waved his primary hand. Noted, he said. Move on. Sova noted it. The session moved on. Nobody asked where the humans were. Nobody sent a message to find out. It was assumed in the quiet way that assumptions grow when no one examines them, that the humans were dealing with something internal. Budget problems, perhaps, or a change in their internal politics. The human systems were always doing something complicated and slightly difficult to follow. It was easier, most of the time, to simply wait for them to sort themselves out and come back. Carter Voss was not coming back. He was sitting in a small office on Callaway Station, a spinning ring of metal and glass that orbited a brown dwarf at the edge of the neutral zone. The office had a viewport that looked out at nothing in particular, just stars and the faint smear of a distant cluster. He liked that view. It did not ask anything of him. On his screen was a list of freight routes which he was adjusting with the careful patience of someone who had done this kind of work for 20 years and no longer needed to think hard about it. He had once spent those same careful hours adjusting supply lines for the entire eastern corridor of Council space. Now he adjusted them for 43 independent traders who paid him a modest monthly fee. The work was quieter. He slept better. A message arrived from Nora Fields. It said, "Still raining on the gas moon." "You?" He wrote back, "Still routing boxes. Nothing has exploded yet." She replied, "Give it time." He smiled and returned to his freight list. Nora was 7 light hours away on a research outpost built into the side of a crater on a moon with no name, just a catalog number. She studied the soil chemistry of low-gravity environments. It was slow, careful, unglamorous work, and she found it deeply satisfying in a way that her 10 years as humanities liaison to the Farron Collective had never quite managed. The Farron had always been polite to her. They had rarely listened to what she said. There was a particular memory she still carried. She had submitted a warning 2 years into her posting about microbial contamination risks in the Farron food distribution network. It was a detailed report. She had spent 4 months writing it. The council committee had thanked her filed it and then done nothing for 18 months until a containment event. 3 distribution hubs made the news. Nobody had called her. Nobody had said she had been right. The event was handled, a statement was issued, and life went on. She had kept showing up to meetings for 3 more years before she finally stopped. That was how it happened for most of them. Not a single big moment. Just a slow accumulation of smaller ones, each unremarkable on its own, each adding a small weight to scale that eventually tipped without drama. 18 months before Carter stopped filing his council reports, his engineering team had submitted a structural analysis of the new hyperspace relay chain being built along the Keshan border. The relay chain was a major infrastructure project, something the council had been planning for years. The humans on the engineering team had run the numbers carefully, checked them twice, and written up a clear warning. Under standard drift stress, the relay nodes would develop fractures within 4 galactic cycles. The design needed adjustment before construction began. The report was received. It was reviewed by a Vorkai technical committee that had already approved the design. It was filed. The construction went ahead as planned. Carter had waited for a response. He had sent a follow-up after 30 days. Then another after 60. No reply came. He checked the project progress reports and saw the construction was moving forward without changes. He read through the committee's review notes and found a single line that described his team's analysis as thorough but not aligned with current engineering consensus. That was all. He did not shout. He did not write an angry letter. He filed his own copy of the report with a timestamp and went home. 3 cycles later, the relay chain began failing exactly where his team had said it would. The fractures appeared in the specific nodes his report had identified. The council initiated emergency repairs. No statement was issued about the prior warning. No message was sent to Carter's team. The repairs were described in council communications as a routine maintenance response to early-stage stress indicators. The humans whose work had predicted the failure were not mentioned. Carter read the maintenance report from his office on Callaway Station. He read it once and then set it aside. He did not call anyone at the council. He did not send the old report back with a note saying he had told them so. He simply did not renew his contract. When it came up the following month, he cited personal reasons, as did most of the others. Petra's home watched all of it from a quiet office on a station that did not appear in any council directory. She was not a dramatic woman. She had no interest in announcements or manifestos. She kept a list, updated weekly, of the humans who had quietly stepped back from council-affiliated work. Contractors, engineers, scientists, pilots, logistics coordinators, diplomats. The list had been growing steadily for 2 years. She did not tell anyone to leave. She did not organize anything that could be called a protest or a movement. She simply made sure that when people were ready to go, there was somewhere for them to go. Independent supply networks, private research funding, routes and contacts that did not run through council infrastructure. She built the quiet alternative piece by piece and said nothing about it to anyone who was not already part of it. On Farron Station, Sova the archivist updated the absence record for the 6th session and filed it away. Outside in the corridor, two council aides were arguing about the schedule for the next summit. The empty seats in the council hall had already been covered with neat cloth panels to keep the dust off the upholstery. Nobody noticed the cloth panels either. That was perhaps the most honest summary of how things stood. The humans left in silence, and the Galactic Council faced the disaster alone. Part 2. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came through a routine monitoring report, the kind that usually sat unread in an archive queue for weeks before a junior analyst got around to it. But this one had an unusual number of red flags attached to it, and so it moved up the queue and landed on the desk of a mid-level Farron infrastructure officer named Belen, who read it twice and then immediately forwarded it to her supervisor. 7 relay nodes had gone dark in the space of 40 hours. Not offline for maintenance, not rerouting due to traffic loads. Dark. No signal, no status ping, no automated response of any kind. Just silence where there had been data moving at high volume less than 2 days before. Belen's supervisor called an emergency technical review. The review pulled in specialists from 3 different departments. They were competent people. They knew their systems. They dispatched repair crews within 6 hours of the initial report, which was, by any reasonable standard, an efficient response. The repair crews arrived at the first failed node and began their assessment. What they found was a structural fracture running along the load-bearing ring at exactly the stress point a human engineering report had described 18 months earlier in a document that was currently sitting in a filing archive on Farron Station under the category of non-priority technical correspondence. The repair crews fixed the node. It took 4 days. While they were fixing it, 2 more nodes failed. The problem was not simply that the nodes were breaking. The problem was that the fractures were propagating through a design flaw that ran through the entire chain, not just a few isolated units. To actually fix the network, you had to understand why the flaw existed, what the original structural logic had been, and what correction would hold under the specific drift stress conditions of that corridor. That understanding required a set of diagnostic frameworks and notation systems that the human engineering team had developed over years of work in exactly that region. Those frameworks existed in documents the human team had produced. The documents were on file with the council, but the notation they used was a professional shorthand that had evolved organically between human engineers who worked together and communicated constantly. It was not a secret language. Any of them could have explained it clearly in an hour, but none of them were answering council communications, and the documents, without the people to interpret them, were like maps written in a script no one at the table could fully read. Belen's team did their best. They fixed what they could see. The network limped along at 60% capacity and continued to degrade. 3 weeks after the relay failures began, a medical supply shortage appeared in the Vorkai home systems. It showed up first as a quiet statistical anomaly in a quarterly health report, then as a shortage notice in 2 regional distribution centers, and then rapidly as something that was affecting real people in real places. The Vorkai were a proud species. They had excellent medical infrastructure. They had well-stocked distribution networks. On paper, their supply chains were working. In practice, medicines were piling up in the wrong facilities and failing to reach the places that needed them in a pattern that the distribution algorithm was not flagging as an error because, from the algorithm's perspective, the deliveries were technically completing. The algorithm had been designed with human input. Specifically, it had been co-written with a logistics firm that had spent 6 years working in Vorkai distribution before quietly letting its counsel licensing lapse the previous year. During those 6 years, the human team had added a layer of biological edge, case handling to the system, a set of conditions that accounted for 17 specific situations where standard routing logic produced technically correct but practically wrong outcomes. Those conditions included things like temperature sensitivity windows for certain compounds cross-species, compatibility flags for shared storage facilities, and a subtle prioritization, waiting for remote colonies that often fell below standard traffic thresholds. The firm was gone. The edge case layer was still therein. The code, but it had not been updated in 8 months, and 2 of its 17 conditions had quietly broken when an upstream data source changed its format. The algorithm no longer knew it was doing anything wrong. The medicines kept going to the wrong places. Children in a Vorkai border colony began showing symptoms that should not have appeared in a well-supplied system. Superfect Inara of the Karite delegation heard about the Vork medical situation through a private channel and felt a tightening in her chest that she recognized as dread. She had been watching the council's operational difficulties accumulate for weeks now, with the specific discomfort of someone who had seen this coming and said nothing loudly enough to matter. She composed a careful message to the last known human diplomatic contact address. It was polite. It acknowledged the lapse in communication. It asked in the formal language her position required, whether there was a channel through which technical consultation might be arranged on a few urgent infrastructure matters. She sent it and waited. 11 days passed. The reply, when it arrived, was brief and flawlessly courteous. It acknowledged receipt of her inquiry. It noted that human diplomatic services were not currently operating a council-linked addresses. It provided a commercial contact channel for general inquiries. It expressed no hostility. It contained no apology. It was, Inara thought, the most perfectly restrained thing she had ever read. She read it 3 times and then sat very still for a while. Velith had by now convened a closed session specifically to address what he was calling the contractor availability issue. He walked into the room expecting a manageable problem with a straightforward solution and walked out 2 hours later looking like a man who had been told that the floor of his house was not technically touching the ground. His senior staff had been patient and thorough. They had explained that the problem was not a shortage of qualified specialists. In the abstract, there were qualified specialists. The difficulty was that human contributors had not simply done technical work. They had carried informal knowledge, the kind that lives in the heads of people who have done a job for a long time and solve problems others have not encountered yet. They had built systems, but they had also maintained relationships between Those systems noticed things that were slightly off before those things became failures and communicated with each other in a dense informal network that produced consistent results without ever being formally documented. That informal network was gone. The formal documentation it had left behind was incomplete, not because the humans had been secretive, but because much of what they knew had never needed to be written down as long as they were still there to answer questions. Velith had asked for a second opinion. The second opinion said the same thing, in different language. He asked for a third. Same again. He closed the session early. That night the main relay hub serving the Thuron inner systems dropped to 30% capacity, and 2 cargo freighters were rerouted on the wrong trajectories because the backup navigation data set had a gap in it where a human cartography team's updated survey was supposed to be. The freighters were recovered. It cost 3 days and a significant amount of fuel. The backup navigation gap was patched with older data. Nobody mentioned where the survey update was supposed to have come from. The Council's daily operational log noted a minor routing incident, resolved without loss, and filed it alongside everything else the humans left in silence. And the Galactic Council faced the disaster alone. Part 3. Nora Fields noticed the problem in the Keshan agricultural belt on a quiet morning while going through environmental data she had been collecting for her own research. She was not looking for it. She simply knew what certain combinations of soil moisture readings and atmospheric chemistry usually meant, because she had spent a decade studying exactly those patterns in agricultural regions across a dozen systems. What she was seeing in the Keshan data was the early signature of a cascade event. It was not dramatic yet. It was a slow wrongness, the kind of thing that looked almost normal if you only glanced at it, but settled into something worrying when you sat with it long enough to understand the direction it was moving. She pulled the historical readings for the belt going back 3 years. She compared them to her own reference models. She checked her math twice because she always checked her math twice. Then she sent a short message to Carter Voss. She wrote, "I am looking at the Keshan soil data. You are not going to like it." He replied within the hour, "How bad?" She sent him the summary. He read it. There was a pause of about 20 minutes. Then he wrote, "So they are going to lose the belt." She wrote back, "At current trajectory, yes. If the monitoring station there were still running the cross-reference protocol our team installed in year 3, they would have caught this 5 weeks ago." Carter did not reply for a while. She pictured him at his viewport looking out at the dark, doing the same thing she was doing, calculating what it meant. How many people the Keshan belt fed. What a 40% agricultural failure would look like, cascading through a system of 12 billion people. Neither of them sent the analysis to the Council. This was not because they did not care. It was because they had tried caring in the formal institutional way for a very long time. They had written reports. They had submitted findings. They had flagged concerns through the proper channels and watched those channels route everything to a quiet archive where it waited to be proven right. They were tired in the particular way. That comes not from doing too much, but from giving something and having it treated as nothing. On the other side of the neutral zone, Commander Drevik of the Vorkai Patrol fleet was having a different kind of bad morning. His unit had been running a standard patrol sweep near a contested debris field on the border of Karate and Torrigan space. The field was not unusual, a dense concentration of old collision fragments from a station that had broken apart 2 centuries ago. His pilots had navigated it dozens of times, but this time the navigation system flagged an anomaly in the field's gravitational pattern, and the flag did not match any of the standard alert categories in the current reference database. Drevik pulled the alert up on his command display and looked at it for a long time. The pattern was distinctive, a rhythmic resonance in the microgravity of the debris field, subtle but consistent, running at a frequency that affected approach vectors in a way that standard evasion models did not account for. It had a particular shape to it that meant something specific about how a ship needed to move through the affected zone. His navigation database had a note attached to a previous version of this alert, a notation added by the human cartography team that had surveyed the field several years earlier. The note had been written in the informal shorthand those teams used among themselves and had not been translated into standard council notation when it was archived. 3 formatting updates later, the note had become a string of characters that the current system displayed as corrupted data. Drevik did not know that. He saw a gravitational anomaly, corrupted data flag, and no clear protocol. He made a command decision. He ordered standard evasive formation and sent 3 ships through the affected zone. 2 of them made it through. The 3rd ship, a mid-range patrol vessel with a crew of 14, cut the resonance at the wrong angle during the transit. The resulting system's failure was rapid. The ship went dark before it could correct. By the time the rescue team reached it, there were 6 survivors. Drevik filed his after-action report in the flat, precise language that military reports require. He noted inadequate navigational data. He noted that standard evasion protocol had proven insufficient for the specific conditions encountered. He recommended a review of the debris field survey records. He did not note that the survey records had been comprehensive and current until 8 months ago. He did not note that the human team responsible for maintaining them had quietly declined their contract renewal, and that no replacement team had been assigned because no one had realized a replacement was needed. He did not note these things because he did not know them. He only knew that the data had been wrong and his crew had died. The council emergency session that followed was unlike any that most of its members had attended before. Every delegation at the table came in carrying something urgent. The Vorkai had fleet losses and a medical crisis. The Farron had a failing communication network and a logistics breakdown. 3 inner systems. The Karate had an agricultural alert from the Keshan belt that had finally made it to the official monitoring queue 3 weeks after Nora Fields had spotted it in independent data. The session was supposed to follow a structured agenda. It abandoned the agenda within the first 30 minutes. Inara sat quietly through the initial chaos of reports and various delegations speaking of each other, the competing demands for priority, the procedural arguments about what counted as an emergency requiring extraordinary measures. She listened to all of it. She had been listening and calculating. For weeks, she had been trying in her careful, political way to decide whether this was the moment to say the thing that everyone in the room was working very hard not to say. She decided it was the. She stood up. The room did not go quiet immediately. She had to wait a beat while the Vorka representative finished his sentence. Then she spoke. She said that the council was looking at a pattern, not a collection of separate incidents. She said that the pattern had a common thread, and the common thread was the absence of human expertise from systems that had been built with human expertise and never designed to function without it. She said that they had not lost contractors. They had lost the people who understood at a detailed and practical level how a significant portion of the council's infrastructure actually worked. And that infrastructure was now showing them, one failure at a time, how much it had depended on knowledge that no one had bothered to formally record. Veleth said this was an overstatement. Inara looked at him and said, "Name one critical system currently underperforming that does not have a human design signature somewhere in its original architecture." The room was quiet. Veleth's secondary hands moved slightly. He did not name one. He asked for the session to take a short recess, and in the tone of his voice was something that Inara had never heard from him before, something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but was in the vicinity of both. Director Petra's home received the session summary that evening. She read through it carefully, all the way to the end. She sent it to her team with a brief note. When one of them asked if it was time to reach out, she said, "Not yet." They asked why. She said they still think they can fix it. Let them try first. It matters that they learn the answer themselves. Her team accepted this. They had learned over time that home was almost never wrong about timing. The humans left in silence, and the Galactic Council faced the disaster alone. Part 4. The Keshan agricultural belt failed. The third week of autumn by the local calendar. It did not fail all at once. It failed the way a wall fails when the foundation beneath it has been shifting for months, first a crack, then another, then a section that simply gives way and brings everything attached to it down, with a sound that seems too loud for something that had been moving so slowly. Nora Fields watched the data update real time from her outpost. She did not feel any satisfaction. She felt the specific heaviness of someone who has watched a preventable thing happen and knows that being right about it helps no one at all. The Council's emergency aid network mobilized within 48 hours. It was a genuine, well-organized effort. Resources were allocated quickly. Supply ships were rerouted. Medical and nutritional aid was prepared and dispatched. The people running the operation were working hard and working competently. And it was still not enough because the coordination model they were using had been designed with human input that had not been updated in over a year. The model worked in most situations. The Keshan situation had 17 specific variables that fell outside the model's calibration, and in those 17 places the aid was slow, or it went to the wrong staging point, or it arrived without the cross-species handling protocols that a human logistics team had quietly maintained as a standing practice, and never formally documented as a requirement. 12 billion people faced a food supply reduction of 40% over 2 cycles. Not all of them would go hungry. Some would be fine. But the buffer zones, the redundancies, the carefully maintained margins that good logistics work builds into a distribution system over years of patient attention, those were thin in ways they should not have been, and they had been thin since 8 months ago when the people who maintained them stopped picking up their council communications. Superfect Inara sat in her office on the 4th day of the Keshan response operation and wrote a message that she had been composing in her head for 3 weeks. She did not write it on official diplomatic stationery. She did not run it through the standard council communication protocols. She used the commercial contact channel that the human reply had directed her to, and she wrote in plain language, as close to personally as her formal training allowed her to get. She said she was not writing to ask for help. She said she was writing because she thought someone should hear directly, that the council understood at least partly what had been lost. She said that she personally had been aware for years that human contributions were being received without proper acknowledgement, and that she had chosen, for political reasons, not to make that observation loudly enough to change anything. She said she was sorry for that choice. She said she did not know if sorry was worth anything at this point, but she thought it should be said anyway because the alternative was to say nothing, and she had already spent too long choosing that alternative. She read the message back once, sent it, and went back to work. The reply came 4 days later. It was not from an official address. It was from a personal account, registered to a logistics operation on Callaway Station. Carter Voss wrote that he had read her message. He wrote that it mattered that she had sent it in those words specifically, not in formal language, not with conditions attached. He did not offer anything beyond that. He did not make promises. He did not ask any questions. He simply acknowledged what she had said and let the channel stay open. Inara read his reply twice. She saved it to her personal files rather than the diplomatic archive. Owen Grant gave his talk at a gathering of young human professionals on a station in the outer reaches of human occupied space. He was not a famous person. He had no official position. People came because someone who knew him had passed along an invitation and said he was worth listening to. He stood at the front of a medium-sized meeting room in front of about 60 people, most of them under 35, and he walked through what had happened in council space without any apparent emotion. He had charts. He had timelines. He had the original engineering report that Carter Voss's team had filed 18 months before the relay chain failed, and he put it on the display screen alongside the council's maintenance report from 6 months later, and he let people look at both of them side by side for a moment before he said anything. He said they are the same document. One was written before the failure. One was written after. The before one has our names on it, and the after one does not. Someone in the audience asked, near the end, whether he thought humans should go back and help with the crisis in council space. He paused for a long time. He said that the question was framed in a way that assumed returning to help was straightforwardly the right thing to do, and that he thought that assumption needed examining. He said that going back on the old terms meant going back into a system that would take what was offered and file the givers under general background support. He said the right question was not whether to help, but what conditions would make the help mean something different this time. What changes written down with real consequences if they were not kept? What structural difference between a seat at the design table and a seat at the review table? He said those were not the same seat, and the council had been offering the second one for 30 years while calling it the first. He said he did not know the answer. He said he thought figuring out the answer was the work. Nobody cheered. They were quiet in a way that felt, to the people in the room, more serious than cheering. Veleth's proposal for a formal audit committee passed on a vote of 11-8, which was the narrowest margin for any council resolution in 6 years. The 8 who voted against it did so for various stated reasons, most of which came down to a reluctance to produce an official record that might later be characterized as an admission of institutional failure. Veleth understood their concern. He voted for the proposal anyway, because the relay network was at 43% capacity, because a Vorkai border colony had been quietly added to the medical emergency list, because the cash response operation was running 12% under its own targets and the gap was widening, and because he had pulled up Carter Voss's 18-month-old engineering report one night and read it beginning to end and had not been able to stop thinking about it since. The report was clear. It was not long. It had used plain language and laid out the problem in a sequence a child could have followed. It had been in the filing system the entire time. It had been there before the first node failed, before the first shortage, before the first ship was lost in a debris field. It had been there, and it had been ignored, and now here they were. Veleth did not say any of this during the vote. He simply voted yes and watched the result come in. When the committee was formally constituted, he was not on it. He had arranged that deliberately. He thought he had done enough damage with his opinions for 1 decade. It was time to let someone else hold the questions. On Callaway Station, Carter Voss received a brief message from Patras. Home. It said only, the committee passed. Watch the next 2 weeks. He wrote back, I'm watching. He meant it. The humans left in silence, and the Galactic Council faced the disaster alone. Part 5. The formal request arrived in Patras. Holmes receiving Q on a Tuesday morning, flagged as priority diplomatic correspondence from the office of Superprefect Nara of the Caridi delegation to the Galactic Council. It was the first official communication addressed to a named human representative in 14 months. Holmes read it standing at her desk, which was the way she read everything she considered important. The message was careful and precise. It requested a conversation, not a summit, not a negotiation. Framework, not a return to formal operations. A conversation. One meeting at a location of humanities. Choosing on terms of humanities. Choosing with no public record and no press. Holmes set the message down and went to make tea. She thought about it for the rest of the morning and most of the afternoon. She sent her reply 2 weeks later. It said yes to a meeting. 1 session, neutral ground, no press. No record. It did not say anything else. The station they chose was small and old, a refueling point near the outer edge of the neutral zone that had been in service for 80 years and showed it. The corridors were narrow and the chairs in the meeting room were karate proportioned, which made them mildly uncomfortable for human bodies in the way that furniture in someone else's house is always slightly off. Home arrived with Carter Voss and Nora Fields. Inara arrived with 2 junior aides, introduced them briefly, and then sent them back to the ship. She sat down across from 3 humans in a room that smelled of old metal and recycled air, and for a moment nobody spoke. Then Inara asked her question. She said, "What would it take for this to be different? Not better. Different. Because better assumes the same structure with adjustments, and she was no longer certain the same structure was what anyone should want." Carter Voss looked at Nora. Nora gave him a small nod, the kind that meant you say it clearly. He said recognition. He was specific about what that word meant because he had learned over years of council work that important words become meaningless if you let people interpret them however is convenient. He said recognition did not mean gratitude or ceremonies or formal credit, listings and press releases. He said it meant structural acknowledgement in the operational sense. It meant that human input was treated as input rather than as background texture that might be incorporated if it happened to align with decisions already made. It meant documentation requirements that included human-readable notation as a mandatory format rather than an optional attachment. It meant being consulted during the design stage of a project, not the review stage. He said the difference was simple. Design shapes what gets built, review approves what has already been decided. Those were not the same stage. The council had been offering one and calling it the other for a long time. Inara wrote everything down by hand. She did not argue with any of it. She asked clarifying questions in a way that made clear she was asking to understand rather than to find openings. She asked what design stage consultation would look like in practice. She asked how documentation requirements could be verified across multiple member species. She asked whether there was a framework already existing anywhere in human institutional practice that could serve as a model. Carter and Nora answered her. The conversation went on for 2 hours. The tree's home sat through all of it without speaking. She watched. She had spent a long time learning to watch before she said anything, and she had learned that what people did in the first hour of a conversation told you more than what they said. Inara asked good questions. She listened to the answers without reshaping them into what she wanted to hear. That was rarer than it should have been. When Home finally spoke, she said 2 things. She said they would need everything formalized in writing, and she said the formalization would need teeth, meaning real consequences. When it was not followed, not statements of disappointment, not internal reviews, but actual structural consequences with names attached to them. Inara said she understood and that she thought it was achievable, not easily, but achievable. She said she would not pretend it would be fast. Home said she was not in a hurry. The return did not look like a return. There was no press announcement. Nobody stood in front of anything and shook hands for a camera. What happened was that Nora Fields sent her Keshan belt analysis, which she had been holding for 3 weeks, to the Council's Environmental Science Division. She sent it with a plain cover note that said it was offered as a professional courtesy with no attached obligations. The analysis arrived and was read within 48 hours by a fair and environmental officer who had been trying to model the same problem from insufficient data. An inquiry was formally opened. A human soil ecologist named Dana Whitfield, who had spent the past year consulting for independent agricultural operations and had a reputation for patient, thorough work, agreed to a short-term contract. The contract had specific deliverables, a clear timeline, and an exit clause she had written herself. She arrived at the Keshen monitoring station 11 days later and got to work. Carter Voss sent 2 supply chain optimization notes to Anara's office. Not formally, not as contracted work. Just 2 brief documents that identified specific bottlenecks in the current Keshen aid distribution and suggested practical corrections. Both were implemented by the relevant departments within a week. Both produced the projected improvements. The quarterly logistics summary noted a 12% efficiency gain in a key distribution corridor. The footnote credited a revised methodology and did not identify the source. Owen Grant did not return to any council-affiliated position. He stayed in his consulting office on the station where he had grown up doing the work he was already doing. But he began appearing at the new preliminary review sessions that Anara had established, the ones where proposals were examined before they became policy documents. These sessions were small and unofficial and produced no minutes. Owen asked questions at them. He asked the kind of questions that caught errors before the errors were built into something expensive and difficult to undo. Some of the questions produced uncomfortable answers that required redesign. All of them made the final proposals better. He charged a standard consulting rate. He was paid on time. Nobody gave a speech about it. Velith reviewed the Keshen A distribution reports on a night when his office was quiet and the station outside had gone into its low light cycle. The numbers were improving. Not quickly, not dramatically, but moving in the right direction with a consistency that suggested the improvement would hold. He called up the old engineering report, the one from 18 months ago. He had looked at it before, but this time he read it slowly from the beginning without skipping anything. It described in plain and careful language exactly what had happened in the relay network in the correct sequence for the correct reasons. The language was not technical in a way that required specialist knowledge. It was written clearly enough that a person of average education could follow it. The report had been in the filing system before the first failure. It had been there and it had been set aside, and here was the thing he kept returning to. It had not been set aside because it was wrong or poorly written. It had been set aside because the people who filed it were human, and the council at that time had not been in the habit of treating human analysis as something worth reading to the end. He did not make a statement about this. He did not call anyone. He sat with it the way you sit with something that is both true and too late to change, and then he opened a document and began drafting a new administrative standard. The standard said that all submitted technical analyses would receive a formal acknowledgement of receipt within 5 days. It said that all analyses would receive a timestamp disposition note within 30 days, including a named reviewer and a brief record of what action, if any, was being taken. It said that analyses flagged as urgent would require a named reviewer within 72 hours. He pushed the standard through the administrative subcommittee over the following 2 weeks quietly without attaching his name prominently to it. It passed. It took effect at the start of the next operational cycle. Patris Home received the new standard in her regular policy digest. She read through it once and set it aside on her secondary screen next to a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she was working. She did not celebrate. She did not send a message to anyone. She returned to the report she had been going through. Outside her port, a human freight carrier came through the outer approach corridor of the neutral zone and registered with the Council traffic network for the first time in 14 months. The automated system sent the carrier a welcome message. The captain of the carrier did not read it. She was already running the calculations for the next leg of her route, noting the corridor conditions, adjusting the arrival estimate by 20 minutes to account for a small drift current that the updated survey data had flagged. The updated survey data was from a human cartography team that had quietly resumed its monitoring work 2 weeks earlier under a new short-term contract with specific deliverables and an exit clause. The captain adjusted her heading and flew on. No one had told her to register with the Council network. No one had made an announcement about it. It had simply become, once again, the practical thing to do. That was all. The humans did not need anyone to make a ceremony of their return. They knew what they brought with them. Wherever they worked, they had always known. That knowledge, quiet and certain and entirely unprepared to apologize for itself, was perhaps the most human thing about them.